Nadia Murad, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as we have an ongoing war, which we've just talked about in Ukraine, one of the terrible things, as you know, and as everybody knows, is the ongoing use of sexual violence and rape against civilians. And even the UN is saying that Russia is using that as part of its military strategy. What did you discuss with First Lady Olena Zelensky? How can you help the Ukrainian women and girls who are so affected?
You know, women have been victims of wars waged by men since the beginning of time. This is not new to Ukraine. If we look back at the history, we can see, you know, in conflicts in Africa, in the Middle East, and here, even here in Europe, that women have been used as weapon of war in conflict. I discussed what we should do right now for survivors with the First Lady of Ukraine.
Of course, I said Zelensky, it's Zelenska.
Zelenska, yeah. She is, you know, she invited me, and it's been 2 months, and I'm still processing what I saw, you know, the Ukrainian people, what they have done for their land, their country, their people. But most importantly, my conversation with survivors who have, you know, endured the worst of, you know, violence in this war. Sometimes we talk and we hear a lot about the war in Ukraine, and it's especially on the, you know, military level. But what I saw was different. It's, you know, women, thousands of women have been sexually abused, and they need support right now.
What do they say they need? How do they describe what they went through and what they're going through now, even though the actual abuse has stopped? How are they processing, living?
Most of them are still not, you know, they don't feel ready to share their stories, but they are going through a lot. They're traumatized. And one of them said, you know, she knows 50 other women who are somewhere and being sexually abused. They were worried about their friends, their relatives who have been through that, but they don't want to share their stories because, as you know, sexual violence comes with a lot of shame and stigma. And I've been there before in Iraq and what happened to thousands of women and girls there.
So I was going to ask you, because you are a survivor of that kind of brutal attack, right? I mean, you are a survivor of sexual violence during the ISIS campaign against your Yazidi people. How did you, I know you've written a lot about it, but in the context of this war happening now 9 to 10 years later, how did you find that they were dealing with the same things you were dealing with? How long did it take you to process, or are you still processing?
I'm still processing, and it's not something that can just go away when the war is over, because it's, it impacts your health on physical and psychological level. And when I started with other Yazidi survivors telling our story, there was no language that I could follow about the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. And I knew no other survivors from other communities that have been through the same. So I wanted, to share my story with the Ukrainian survivors, to tell them that someone else have been there before them, and that this is not their fault, and that they deserve justice and they deserve support, reparations. So they knew a little bit about, the use of sexual violence, but not that much. So I'm hoping that we can do better for them, because the international community did nothing about, the use of sexual violence by ISIS. It was only seen as a side effect until survivors shared their stories.
So that's very interesting, because obviously in the 90s, the International Criminal Tribunal did make sexual violence in war a war crime. And they did prosecute those who were responsible for that in the illegal war in Bosnia, and also the genocide of Rwanda. And yet, no accountability has come to the ISIS perpetrators, right? Is that because they can't be found? Is that because, why not?
Actually, there has been 3 cases in Germany, only in Germany. But we have thousands of evidence, testimonies, the documentations. ISIS themselves and the whole world watched when they publicly did everything. And today, as we speak, 9 years later, we still have close to 3,000 women and children missing in captivity. Survivors are, sharing their stories, and what is missing, it's the political will. It's not about that we don't have enough evidence. It's not about that survivors don't want to share their stories. We just need, and Germany had, made it clear that it is possible.
So as you say, there are these nearly 3,000, I think you said nearly
3,000,
nearly
yeah.
3,000 who are missing. You also, though, on the positive side, have been able to save, rescue and bring home a number of these women. Tell me about that. How many? How did you manage it? Where did you take them from?
This number is huge. Some of them were children when they were taken into captivity. Now they are adults in captivity. We don't have a lot of information about, where they are. We know that they are in Syria, in some parts of Turkey, and even in Iraq. This needs an international, support, because we're, I'm one person, Nadia's initiative, our team on the ground is collecting evidence, working with the families, but it's really difficult to do it alone when our own government has done nothing.
When you say your own government, you
Iraqi government, they have done nothing to rescue a single person from, captivity. And the international community, when the coalition against ISIS was established, the rescuing of women and children was not a part of it. So as soon as ISIS was defeated, everyone would, moved on, and the people are still missing in captivity. So we try with the families. Families, sometimes they have some information where they are, and we try to, work with the families, with the community, and bring them back.
As this 9th year anniversary, which is not a good way to call it, but the 9th year since this genocide, you're also noticing that there have been no graveyards, no sites, no memorials, and you're trying to adjust that, aren't you? You're trying to make up for that. What are you trying to build, and for what purpose?
I want to build something that, generations from now will remember what ISIS did to a community like mine, because that's not very, unique to the Yazidi community. Minorities are being marginalized for generations in that region. I think my mother and my 6 brothers, my, friends, neighbors, and relatives all deserve to be remembered for what, they've sacrificed. And unfortunately, nothing is being done to, for the community to come together for a date like this, to just come together and remember those we've lost. And I hope that we can build something, we can build our community, and it can be an example that we can use in Ukraine and other post-conflict zones to make sure that we remember those who have sacrificed their lives and the region, and send a clear message to ISIS and other groups that impunity is not an option, and their crimes and violence will always be there, and generations of people will see it.
You've been to Germany. You say, the only cases that have been prosecuted are in Germany. You probably now in Europe, a lot of anti-immigration, right-wing sentiment it's just boiling against refugees, even though there's not a massive refugee crisis in our countries. What do you make of that? How do you interpret or understand what's happening in Europe when it comes to trying to protect, these people who are under such threat?
No, we know that now the number of refugees, of displaced people, have surpassed 100 million people.
Around the world.
Around the world.
It's the worst crisis in UN history.
And the number is growing. And we can just, look at what some countries, their policies, there are walls being built, their, governments are just against. And we know that the future of refugees, these 100 million people, is not bright. And so many people are against refugees, welcoming them. But at the same time, we can't keep people in displaced camps forever. We have to work together to make sure that we help the most vulnerable ones. And we also work together to rebuild post-conflict societies. So if people cannot make it here to the UK, we can help them to go back home. And this is what we've been doing in Sinjar, Iraq. We know that no country is ready to bring all the Yazidis. So since there's no war, why not working together to make sure that people go back to their homes and rebuild their lives?
As you say, this is something that's happened in Europe. It's happening now in Europe. It happened in the Middle East, in your region. It's happened in Africa and many, many other parts of the world. So Sudan right now is in the midst of a terrible crisis. I'm going to read some of the statistics because they really are quite shocking. In Sudan, officials are warning about a spike in this kind of violence against women and girls. Apparently, before the latest round of civil war broke out in April, more than 3 million Sudanese women and girls were at risk of violence against them. This now has climbed to 4.2. In other words, another million more are at risk, according to the UN. And this is what Martin Griffiths, who's the leader of the Emergency Relief Coordination, he says, it's unconscionable that Sudan's women and children, whose lives have been upended by this senseless conflict, are being further traumatized in this way. What we are witnessing in Sudan is not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a crisis of humanity. Can you explain for people who might not understand why it is war that really makes this such a worse problem for women? What is it about war and the actions that happen in war that increase this violence against women?
I just want to say that those numbers represent real people like me. They're not just numbers. There are real people behind these numbers. And I think it's because of how we treat women before war. I can talk about Iraq. There were no laws to protect women or women's rights. And the way we treat women in times of peace gives us a very clear, answer on how women will be treated during the time of war. And we need to, combat the gender bias and stereotypes in our families, societies, and school. And it always, goes down to education and equality.
Well, you are really waving that flag for equality and awareness. So Nadia Murad, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.